Good. Thank you very, very much for the invitation, first of all, from AIA to come and talk to you today about social license and its implications in the food industry. And the title comes from a conversation that I had a couple of months ago with a good friend of mine, Sylvain Charlebois at University of Dalhousie. And we were talking about some of the issues that are going on in the social media around food and all that kind of thing. And one or the other of us commented that it sounded like a bunch of foolish noise. And so that's where the title came from. My particular background, as you can read in the bio, in the booklet, I'm actually a professional engineer, chemical engineer by training, so I'm a little sensitive to some of the comments about the oil and gas industry. But I actually never did a stick of chemical engineering work. I did mostly sales and marketing, believe it or not, and some manufacturing in the chemical industry. So went into the food consulting business about 15 or so years ago. And today we want to talk to you about social license. Why does it matter? Maybe give a little bit of a perspective on its impact on the food system in Canada and elsewhere, and then a little bit of insight that hopefully will help you as a professional agrologist as to what's coming next. And when we talk about the food system, this is a particularly interesting diagram, and I don't claim any authorship on it. I got it from a nice website called nourishlife.org. And when I show this to university students, you know, their heads spin off and into space, but the only point really behind this is it's extremely complex. And as we saw this morning with the spaghetti diagram and carbon and energy usage and everything like that, it just basically says what this says. But the interesting things is that it's not just an economic system, it's not just a biologic system, which is of course what you folks all deal with, but it's also a political system and a social system. So there's a lot of things at play here. And what we're going to be talking about for the next few minutes is really the social aspect of what we're talking about here. And when you talk about social license, this was really interesting. I started looking into the issue of social license about this time 2 years ago, and then really started getting into it about a year ago. And it was because of my work on food traceability that I kept coming across this phrase called social license. And it was often used in terms of sustainability, economic or environmental sustainability. And as I started to look into it more and more and more, what I found was, of course, there were all kinds of definitions of what social license was and where it came from. So you'd have somebody from the mining industry saying, well, you don't get social license by going to the government and asking for it, right? It really is much more built on long-term successful relationships with communities. And this is what Rory McAlpine and Maple Leaf Foods were talking about, for example. Social license is fundamentally about accountability to people, according to Greenpeace, right? So you've got an NGO now giving you a perspective on what they think social license is. And then the head of Thornley Flawless Communications said resource extraction proponents are facing challenges as a result of their inability to secure social license. And that leads to costly delays. In fact, if you look at a lot of the literature around what is social license, what you tend to find is that most of the literature focuses on the loss of social license, not on the process of actually gaining social license, right? So it becomes this kind of negative argument about what social license is. So what exactly is it? Well, it was actually, believe it or not, coined by James Cooney, who was a mining executive, and I've forgotten the name. It might have been the BC industry, but he was talking about the growing disruption of mining projects by communities who no longer were willing to put up with the expansion of a mine or of the introduction of a new operation into their community. And so what was happening is that he was actually talking with the World Bank, and he just mentioned the word social license. And that is around 1997, as I said, when that would happen. And it basically, he was saying, is that you need this social license just as much as you need a license from the regulator or from the government. And that was the context within which the word social license was actually developed. So when you go through the literature, as I say, you'll find ample descriptions and definitions of what social license is. And so what I tend to do is I'll pick this one here, which says it is the privilege of operating with minimal restrictions. So basically any kind of regulation or legislation or a market imposition on your operation, right? So and it really is built on this whole notion of maintaining public trust. When we were talking about, Rory showed the model of trust is built upon character and competence, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But what is important about social license in the food industry, which is what is of interest to you, is that it is a growing and substantial risk to most businesses now. So why do I care? Well, we talked about the risk, and compliance with regulations is obviously no longer sufficient. So the reason it becomes a risk is that there's so many different ways that society can actually withhold permission for your business or your industry to do what it wants to do. So just a short list of things that kind of impact on that discussion are the lack of scientific knowledge. So, and Rory mentioned, you know, the worst thing you can do to somebody is demonstrate how ignorant they are of science, right? So, so you've got to figure out a way of explaining to people very complex scientific or technical details of an operation or of a project, and yet at the same time bring up their level of scientific understanding. The faith in government oversight constantly under pressure. And I think if there's anybody here that deals with or is from the provincial or federal government will understand that fact, is that governments are under constant pressure for accountability, for oversight, and yet at the same time they are under a microscope on a daily basis as to being accountable for sometimes things that they actually have no power to affect. The industry or company track record can have an impact on the discourse that occurs. So as we heard earlier from Keith, one bad actor can throw an entire industry into the trash bin. And we've seen that many times, going back to my experience when I was working with the DuPont company. The DuPont company was very proud of its record of safety and so forth. So when things like Bhopal and so forth occur, it actually hurt the business of DuPont because that was their business. What happens when a plane goes down? An Airbus 320 goes down. Boeing is the one that suffers, right? So it's not just Airbus that suffers from that. So, and then there's also this notion of what we call a prosumer, which, you know, is a classic consulting word, right? Nobody knows what it means and it can mean anything. But basically, the prosumer is somebody who not only is a consumer, but actually a provider of information to the marketplace. And so the most common sort of manifestation of that is social media. So bloggers, opinion writers, and so forth. So prosumers are actually providing content in competition with the science community, right? And so that's why you get this kind of, you know, silliness in the marketplace about, you know, linking, you know, vaccinations with autism and things like that, right? So prosumers actually tend to be somewhat suspicious and cynical, and so they tend to lead the community in a particular direction. So I had to put this guy in here. So loss of social license is a significant factor now and has been in the past, and we'll talk about some historic issues. But just recently, you know, Brexit was a classic example of losing social license, right? People go, what do you mean? You know, there's nothing to do with it. It was all economics. No. People basically distrust the system, so they just back away and they just say, okay, you get the system fixed and we'll start to talk again, right? And so that's a classic sort of loss of social license. Same thing when British Petroleum had the Deepwater Horizon blow up off the shores of the United States in the Gulf of Mexico. And that hurt the entire industry for a period of time. Samsung Electronics. Anybody buy a Samsung 7? You know, and the FAA in the United States is telling you, if you've got one of these phones, don't bring it on the plane, right? So that's when the rise of the alternate right movement, not just in the United States, but elsewhere, and that sort of inflamed political discourse that results from it. And increasing concerns about food and food fraud. So these are examples of where the loss of social license is actually having very real impacts on businesses. And they go beyond that business, so I promised I would talk about this a little bit, but these are historic situations. So Union Carbide in Bhopal in 1984, where they wiped out a village. The Peanut Corporation of America in 2008. Does anybody remember that one? That was really kind of cool, where it was contaminated peanuts that got into the entire food supply. When we talk about contaminating food, Volkswagen 2 years ago. That was 2 years ago. It just seems like yesterday, right? And it impacted the entire automotive industry. And they're still digging themselves out from that hole that they created. Chipotle, they had a vision of food with integrity, believe it or not, right? That was their vision. And yet nearly 500 people got sick from food that was linked to their restaurants in the United States. So those are, again, examples of the cost of losing social license. Chipotle was damaged to the extent of $10 billion off of its peak stock price. So the actual value, capital value of that company was impacted for $10 billion. And revenue was down a year later. So we talk about trust, and the most automatic sort of thought process we have is, well, if you don't have trust, you can't get social license, which is fine. And then a gentleman over here mentioned, well, think about it on the other way around, and that is, social license actually helps get you trust, right? Or that trust is actually a byproduct of getting social license. What you see if you read the literature is that there are 3 common characteristics of earning social license to operate. That is transparency, fairness, and informed consent. So when we talk about transparency, we're really talking about the intent of the individual or the organization or the business or what have you. So we're talking about the character, if you will, of that organization. Its intent to be open to divergent views. So when you are dealing with an organization that is closed or is not prepared to listen, or in the examples that Keith was giving where they just outright, stand firm and close the doors, that is demonstrating a lack of transparency, and the intent becomes presumed from that is that you are trying to hide something, right? And so the trustworthiness of the organization or you as an individual is called into question if you're not prepared to be open and transparent. Around fairness, this really talks to the whole issue of integrity. And what I talk about here is making sure that you include the smaller voices. So when we're talking about social license to operate, a lot of the times people think about big organizations, Greenpeace, all of this kind of thing, the NGOs. And those voices are important, but it's also important to hear the smaller voices. We talk about indigenous communities, we talk about the individual consumer in the food industry, that kind of thing. And it also gets to the whole issue of being authentic. So being human, right? Stop being the corporate mouthpiece and start thinking and behaving and understanding as a human being and relate, as Rory said, empathically to the folks that you're dealing with. Informed consent is pretty obvious, but what that does is it actually helps build dialogue, and informed consent relies on the other two. So you don't get to informed consent, that is, somebody gives you the permission to keep doing what you want to do, but it's not a veto. And this is where a lot of the times when I'm having these conversations with folks like yourselves, that people say, well, if I'm going to go through this process on social license, does that mean that I have to give somebody a veto on what I'm trying to do? That's not what this is about. It's about the dialogue of informed consent. So it really is about trying to understand what the issues are, not giving up power or in some way losing power yourself. So Thompson and Boutillier a couple of years ago developed this model, and this is a social science model based on stakeholder communications. So they went through a lot of literature and actually developed a little bit of a working model about what is the process that you need to go through in order to develop social license. And so they started with this after doing a number of surveys, and that is, if you think about it as increasing levels of validation. And at the bottom of this, you have basically a situation where social license is completely withheld, right? And in order to earn your way to a position where people are even prepared to listen to you, you have to have some form of legitimacy. In order to have some form of legitimacy, you have to, getting back to Rory's model, have some competence. So you can't stand up here and talk like a boob and expect people to think that you're competent. On the other hand, if you sound really, really intelligent and yet come across as a jerk, pardon the expression, then you lose out on that side, and oftentimes that character trait is the one that has the most damage. And so what you're trying to do initially is just establish legitimacy. And we'll talk a little bit about the characteristics of what that looks like in the next slide. Once you have that, you've got some level of acceptance. That doesn't mean that everybody's embracing you, but at least you have permission to continue the conversation. And if you continue to build on that relationship, then you get to what they call is this threshold of credibility. So you now cross over into a place where you're not only accepted, but it's approved what you're trying to do. So if you want to build a mine in the middle of the rainforest in Brazil, you've got that approval. And then from there, you actually earn trust. And that trust is that kind of final threshold that when you cross over that level where you finally have earned that trust, you have what's called co-ownership with the communities that you're talking to. So that means that there is an equal sense of ownership over what it is we're talking about. We're not on the opposite side of the table now, we're on the same side of the table, and the problem is here, and we're trying to solve that problem. And this is what it looks like if you were to characterize it from the stakeholder's point of view and the basis of the relationship. So the basis of the relationship, you listen to the conversations that we have. It's really fascinating once you start to look at this. If somebody is talking all about the economic impact and the financial benefit of a particular situation or a project to you as an individual, they're really just trying to establish legitimacy, right? If the predominant conversation is economic and financial, it tends to be around legitimacy. I'm just trying to establish legitimacy. If I don't even get that, you will get literally physical resistance, direct obstruction. People will put up, billboards around your plant, or they'll block your road into your mining site or whatever, and you'll get all kinds of legal challenges, right, as Keith was talking about. In the middle, you've got this growing transactional trust and social legitimacy growing, but the emphasis on transactional. So what we mean by that is, if you think of a food company, there's a lot of transactional trust there, but it is based on transactions. It's an unusual situation where you get enough trust to actually institutionalize that in a partnership. And up at the top of this model, we've got the notions of joint decisions and co-managing. You read the technical literature and they talk about psychological integration, whatever that means. But the point is that you're gradually building, through credibility and trust, this notion that you're on the same team, right? So how do we do that? The food industry, quite interesting, and Rory mentioned the Center for Food Integrity has been going through a lot of studies recently and surveys, and what they were looking at is creating this model for the food industry around building social license. And my point to them is, why would you do that when there's already plenty of industries out there that have already done this, particularly when you look at resource industries and so forth. So the experience of other industries can actually help the food industry along here, I think. Begin with basic local efforts to build that legitimacy. And this is where AIA can come into play, I think. Empower that broader stakeholder participation in the discussion. Don't have to convince anybody yet of a particular point of view, just engage them in the discussion. And it's kind of reducing the echo chamber effect, I think I call it. You know, it's just don't talk to the same people you always talk to. Talk to some consumers, which is really powerful, because a lot of the times you'll get some very, very diverse viewpoints. And then look at, in that conversation, where you could somehow find mutually beneficial ownership over it. And within this food system, by addressing the industry's need for legitimacy, we can actually then start to pursue the notion of social license at a business level and at an industry level. Broaden that dialogue and leverage social media. Consumer is now the new CEO of the food organizations in this country. If you don't believe that, just look on social media. Engage these people before, not necessarily with perfect information, right? So I'm just giving you some thoughts here on how you could start to develop the process around social license. Engaging rather than waiting for perfect information. Don't try and convince people how smart you are. Just convince them that you have some character and you're prepared to listen. And then government's role, I get asked about that by the government a lot of times, and I basically say, actually, your best thing is to stay out of the way at this point. Because if the government comes in and starts messing around, then it's no longer social license, it's regulation, right? So it's important that government understand what's happening and may actually, in fact, have some interesting input into that. But you're not looking for the government to solve this. This is not a government regulation issue. This is an industry that's looking for some way to develop a stronger relationship with their customers. So what are we doing next? From a research point of view, we're looking at understanding what is the state of SLO in Canada's food system. So there's a lot of work going around surveys. There's a general desire to understand this, but a lack of real direction right now. And so we're going to be doing some validation, engaging of stakeholders, look at the proven approaches that other industries have done, use those lessons in those industries like textiles and resources, forestry, for example. And I would suggest that we need to open a dialogue with the leaders in those industries because they've actually lived through this. So rather than just sort of read some literature, actually bring those people into the conference room and say, hey, look, how did you deal with this particular issue? And then you have to obviously, and you know, Maple Leaf is doing a terrific job on this, is establish some meaningful measures of how you can make progress in these areas. So what can AIA do? I try to bring this down to your level, is you're a respected voice out there, so why don't you proactively understand how you can help them understand? Explain what social license is and why it's important. Or join in efforts to understand SLO in the food system. There's a lot of research that needs to be carried out. Maybe there's some things that AIA could be doing to help further that discussion. Leverage events like this to open up that dialogue and facilitate the awkward moments, right? This morning was a great example of that. Very, very divergent views being heard around the room, and yet I didn't get a sense that anybody was terribly uncomfortable about that debate. But at the same time, understand that that's a position as a professional that you place yourself in. So you're almost like the referee, right? So help facilitate those awkward moments, and then really look at this whole social media conversation that's going on. Look for the opportunity to engage when you see somebody saying something online that completely comes out of left field. Don't try and convince them that they're wrong, just try to understand what it is that's really concerning them. And this is one of my favorite quotes this month, but it is particularly applicable here by Thomas Edison, and that is, a lot of the times the opportunities that present themselves to you look a lot like work, and that's because that's typically what they are. And this is going to be another one of those examples. You're going to say, why would I do this? Well, it's just opportunity dressed up that looks like work. So.